Iraq became the religious battleground between two neighboring imperial clans, the Persian Safavids and the Turkish Ottomans. The Ottomans, who were Sunni Muslims, had created an empire by raiding Christian lands under Byzantine control. This they considered a duty, a jihad. The glittering Byzantine capital of Constantinople, the elegant Christian Orthodox city on the Bosphorus, was taken in 1453 and renamed Istanbul.
The Ottomans were the greatest military machine of the late Middle Ages and the early modern period even. They were the ones to introduce muskets for their infantry. And the Ottoman armies proved to be invincible, really.
In 1520, the 10th Sultan succeeded his father as emperor. A brilliant military strategist known in the West as Suleiman the Magnificent, he was called by his own people Kanuni, the lawgiver. Under Suleiman, the Ottoman Empire reached its zenith and became a true world power. The Safavid dynasty was founded by Shah Ismail in 1499, ending a period of instability and disorder in the later stages of the 15th century. The Safavid state formed the geographical and political foundations of modern Iran.
They started out as being a mystical Muslim community in the mountains of Azerbaijan. Eventually they would adopt Shia Islam and became fervent Shia Muslims. Under Shah Ismail, who was the first ruler of the Safavid Empire, Shia Islam was imposed upon the population of the conquered areas.
Shah Ismail invaded Iraq in 1508, partly to take possession of its two holiest Shiite cities, An-Najaf and Karbala. Sultan Suleiman considered himself the supreme arbiter of Islamic affairs, and as a Sunni was not prepared to allow two such sacred sites to fall under Shia authority. He decided to take immediate action.
They needed to conquer it, not only to defeat the Shia Persians and acquire legitimacy as Sunnis, but Iraq also represented for Suleiman the Magnificent the seat of the Abbasid Empire. For him, by conquering Iraq, he was resurrecting this Abbasid Empire. He viewed himself as the inheritor of the legacy of the Abbasids.
Suleiman began his campaign in Iraq in 1533. Surprisingly, a year later, he had captured the former Abbasid capital of Baghdad without a bloodbath taking place.
Baghdad surrendered quite easily to the Ottomans. Sunni scholars go out to Suleiman and they give him the keys of the city, saying, please take it over. We have been subjected to this persecution by the Safavids and we need you to take it over.
Despite Suleiman's complete victory, the Ottomans and Safavids continued to fight for control of Iraq long after the Sultan's death in 1566. The Safavids were driven out permanently in 1638, and Iraq was then formally absorbed into the Ottoman Empire. But the next 2 centuries proved difficult for Suleiman's descendants. The region was almost impossible to govern.
It was a very fractured society. Tribalism was very strong in many parts, and in fact most people were either rural or tribal. The cities were small and few, and the Ottomans governed through a rather thin administration, mainly of Ottoman Turks, but with some Arabs as well. And it was Islam, the belief in Islam, Islamic institutions and so on that held it together.
At the beginning of the 19th century, the Ottoman government imposed central authority on the region. they divided it into 3 administrative districts, which together would form the geopolitical base of modern Iraq. These were Mosul, Baghdad, and Basra. Basra was Iraq's only access to the Persian Gulf and was growing into a center of international trade. In the 20th century, the caliphs would have to contend with foreigners who were casting acquisitive eyes over their wealth.
Everybody knew that sooner or later they were going to find oil across the border in what was then Ottoman Iraq.
Crude oil was discovered. In Britain, Winston Churchill, then colonial undersecretary and soon to become First Lord of the Admiralty, was convinced that oil, not coal, was the fuel of the future. In 1909, the Anglo-Persian Oil Company was formed between Britain and the new government of Iran to develop the industry.
Everybody knew that sooner or later they were going to find oil across the border in what was then Ottoman Iraq. British investments increased, British presence increased, and already there were well-detailed plans to conquer at least the southern part of the country prior to World War I.
On the 1st of August 1914, Germany, spurred on by the need for natural resources provided by overseas colonies and a desire for greater international influence, declared war on Russia. The First World War juggernaut got underway. When the Ottoman Empire took the side of Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire against the Allies, Britain found its commercial interests in the Middle East suddenly threatened. In November 1914, the British Army occupied Basra to defend the Anglo-Persian Oil Company's oil fields and refineries in neighboring Iran. Starting in 1916, the British engaged in a series of offensives that eventually led to the capture of Baghdad. They entered the city on the 11th of March 1917 under the command of General Sir Frederick Stanley Maude. "9,000 Turkish soldiers surrendered. General Maude announced to the citizens of Baghdad,
"Our armies do not come into your cities and lands as conquerors or enemies, but as liberators."
The British Army continued to move north until it captured Mosul early in November 1918. Britain then controlled almost all of Iraq. The Ottoman Turks were beaten and the Allies were on the brink of victory everywhere in Europe. The First World War had at last come to an end. Iraqis and Arabs from other Ottoman provinces in the Middle East hoped their long-held dream of freedom and self-determination would finally come true.
An Arab nationalist movement of sorts had already started before World War I. And many of the Arab army officers and civil servants and intellectuals who had been, some of them educated in Istanbul, were opposed to control by the Turks.
At the peace conference at Versailles in 1919, all Arab hopes of independence were dashed. The Ottoman provinces were divided between France and Britain by the League of Nations. Iraq, as well as Palestine, became a mandate under British authority.
These countries were deemed to be almost ready for independence, but they were going to need help from foreign powers to prepare them for independence. Nation building, we call it today.
Arnold Wilson was the administrator in charge of the Iraq mandate.
He argued that it was in British interest to bring civilization to Iraq, to Mesopotamia, and that this could only be done through direct English rule over the country. Thus, he brushed aside any claims of Iraqis to participate in the governance of the country.
Enraged at being shut out from the government of their country, 100,000 armed Iraqis rose in revolt against their new rulers in July 1920.
In the Iraqi view, of course, this is the first national rebellion against British colonialism.
It took the British Army 3 months to crush the rebellion. By 1921, the colonial secretary, Winston Churchill, was persuaded to end direct rule of Iraq and put an Arab leader on the throne who would, hopefully, cooperate with Britain. So he invited Prince Faisal Al Hussein to become monarch of the new state. He was not himself an Iraqi, but a member of the Hashemite family, which governed the holy city of Mecca.
Faisal